The date is the spring of 1942. A British colonel, a career officer named Geoffrey Keyes, stands at the edge of a training ground somewhere in the American South. He has spent 22 years in the British Army. He has fought in the desert. He has stood in the parade grounds of Sandhurst, walked the same flagstone corridors that produced Wellington's officers, Churchill's officers, the men who built an empire with discipline and tradition and generations of institutional memory. And now he is watching something he has never seen before in his life. Several hundred young men, farmers, factory workers, insurance clerks, a used car salesman from Ohio, a school teacher from Vermont, are learning to be soldiers. They have been in uniform for 8 weeks. Some of them still look faintly startled to be holding a rifle. Their drill is imperfect. Their marching is adequate. Their posture would cause a Sandhurst instructor to quietly weep. But there is something else happening that Keyes cannot quite categorize. Something in the speed, something in the sheer industrial scale of the operation, in the row upon row of barracks stretching to the horizon, in the conveyor belt precision of the intake process, in the way the United States Army has taken civilian men, tens of thousands of them, and begun doing something to them in a matter of months that the British Army had always believed took years. He writes in his diary that night, "The Americans seem to believe that a soldier can be manufactured. I am not yet convinced they are wrong." That sentence is the beginning of a story that will end on battlefields across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and France. A story that will eventually force British officers, proud, experienced, thoroughly skeptical British officers, to confront something they had not anticipated. Not that the Americans were better soldiers, but that the Americans had built something the British didn't have a word for yet, a system. And systems, it turns out, can be more dangerous than tradition. But to understand what shocked those British officers, you first need to understand what they were comparing it to. Because to the British military mind of 1942, a soldier wasn't trained, a soldier was made. And the making took time, a very particular, very English kind of time. Picture what the British Army believed a soldier was in the year 1939. It wasn't just a man with a rifle, it was an institution. A man who had absorbed the culture of his regiment, who had marched and drilled and served until the Army's rhythms were his rhythms, until the rank system was not something imposed on him from outside, but something that had become part of how he understood the world. The British Army at its best was a professional force of exceptional quality. At its worst, it was a class-stratified bureaucracy where promotion moved at the speed of inheritance, and officers were expected to be gentlemen first and tacticians second. The Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst had been producing British Army officers since 1802. Not quickly, not cheaply. A gentleman cadet at Sandhurst in the interwar years spent between 1 and 2 years in residence before receiving his commission. He learned military science, certainly, but he also learned something harder to quantify, a way of carrying himself, a manner of speaking to subordinates and superiors, a set of social codes that defined what it meant to belong to the officer class. He attended dinners. He played sport. He participated in the rituals that had governed British military life for over a century. This wasn't vanity, it was philosophy. The British Army believed with deep institutional conviction that leadership was a quality that could not be rushed, that the authority of an officer derived not just from his technical competence, but from something more intangible. His belonging to a tradition, his embodiment of continuity. You couldn't manufacture that in 90 days. You couldn't test for it with a written examination. You grew it slowly in a particular kind of soil. And then there was the enlisted soldier. He typically served a standard enlistment of 7 years plus 5 in reserve. By the time a British infantryman was considered battle-ready, he had spent years absorbing his regiment's identity. He knew the regiment's history, its battle honors, its marching songs. The regiment was family, tribe, and profession simultaneously. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who would later command British and Allied forces in North Africa, Sicily, and Northwest Europe, complained repeatedly in his early wartime dispatches about replacement soldiers who arrived at units without proper preparation. In September 1942, his 8th Army received 860 reinforcements from Britain for the battered 50th Division. Of those 860 men, records showed that only 1 in 4 had done any field firing at all. 9 had never in their lives fired a Bren gun. 7 had never fired a rifle. 131 had never thrown a live grenade. These were men who had technically passed through some version of training, but the system that was supposed to catch them had gaps, big gaps. Here is the first piece of the puzzle. The British Army believed in deep, slow regimental formation of soldiers. But by 1939, the machinery for doing that at scale, for millions of men rapidly, didn't really exist. And what would shock British officers about the Americans wasn't just that they did things differently. It was that they seemed to have thought about mass production in a way that the British, anchored to tradition, had not. There's another dimension to this. The British officer corps, despite its many strengths, had been losing its best people for a generation. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff from 1941, wrote privately about this problem with painful clarity. He noted that the cream of British manhood, the natural leaders, the men who would have become the platoon commanders and battalion officers of the next war, had been killed in the previous one. The First World War's Western Front had consumed an entire generation of the kind of men who made armies work. Britain came to 1939 not just short of trained soldiers, it was short of the officers who would have trained them. Remember that shortage. It becomes important when you see what the Americans were building in its place. Because in Washington, in the spring of 1941, a quiet, methodical general named Leslie McNair was looking at a very different problem, and he was solving it in a way that no army in history had quite attempted before. The United States Army on December 7, 1941, the day the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, numbered fewer than 190,000 soldiers. The United States needed an army of 8 million, and it needed it, roughly, by yesterday. McNair had been studying the problem for years. He was not a man who attracted historical attention the way Patton or Eisenhower did. He was deliberately invisible, a quiet, nearly deaf general who communicated in memos and training directives. He was killed by a stray American bomb during the Operation Cobra bombardment on July 25, 1944. The same bombardment that you heard about in the context of the Era Court story. He died doing exactly what he had spent his career doing, getting as close as possible to the reality of combat, trying to understand it better. He was found in a foxhole near the bomb line, still observing, still taking notes. But in 1941 and 1942, McNair was building something remarkable. He was building what the Army called the Army Ground Forces Training System, and its philosophy was, in one sense, the exact opposite of everything the British believed. McNair was betting that a soldier was not grown. A soldier was manufactured, and that if you were smart enough about the manufacturing process, you could make a very good one in a surprisingly short time. That bet would take years to prove, and the British officers who came to watch the early stages of the experiment were not impressed. Not impressed at all. But there was something McNair had seen that those British officers hadn't been forced to reckon with yet. Something hiding in the plain sight of the American civilian population. Something that would make the whole machine possible. Here's a number that should stop you. In 1939, the United States Army had roughly 174,000 soldiers. By the end of 1945, it had 8.2 million men and women in uniform. That is not a military expansion. That is the military equivalent of building the entire city of New York from scratch, while simultaneously running it. Think about what that requires. You don't just need recruits. You need rifles, uniforms, and boots in their sizes. You need mess halls and barracks. You need drill sergeants, medical staff, cooks, and clerks. All of them drawn from the same civilian population you're trying to turn into soldiers. You need 242 separate training camps and forts by 1945, stretching from the swamps of Florida to the deserts of Arizona. And most of all, you need a system for deciding in very little time who each of those millions of men actually is and what role they can play. That system began with a piece of paper on the day an American draftee arrived at an induction center before he received his uniform, before he touched a weapon, before he spoke to a drill sergeant. He sat down and took a test. It was called the Army General Classification Test, the AGCT, and it was, in its way, one of the most consequential documents in the history of modern warfare. The AGCT was developed by a team of Army psychologists in 1940 and 1941. It measured verbal, quantitative, and spatial aptitude across 150 questions. It was calibrated so that a raw score of 100 represented the average. Scores ran from below 80, grade 5, limited aptitude, up to 130 and above, grade 1, which qualified a man for officer candidate school, advanced technical training, and specialist roles. Over 9 million men took the AGCT during World War II. 9 million. That is 3 times the population of modern New Zealand. The data set it generated was, at the time, the most comprehensive measurement of a nation's cognitive distribution ever assembled. And the Army used it deliberately. A farm kid from Iowa who scored a 135 on the AGCT didn't necessarily go to the infantry. He went to officer candidate school, or he went to one of the Army's technical programs, engineering, communications, aviation mechanics. A man who scored a 90 went to the infantry or the artillery. The score directed the man to the job for which he was most likely to succeed. British officers who encountered the system did not initially find it impressive. They found it odd. In the British Army, the relationship between a man and his regiment was almost familial. You served with your county's regiment. You built your identity around that unit. The American system was more clinical, more corporate in a way. A man was assessed and then routed like a package sorted by zip code. It seemed to lack the human dimension that the British believed was essential to making good soldiers. What those British officers missed, and what would gradually become clear to them over the following years, was that the AGCT was solving a problem the British system didn't acknowledge having. In a mass conscript army of 8 million drawn from every corner of a continent-sized country, the old regimental system wasn't an option. You couldn't know every man. You couldn't rely on shared history and shared hometown and the accumulated social weight of the regiment's identity. You had to find another way to match men to roles quickly and accurately enough that the whole machine didn't collapse under its own weight. The AGCT was that way, imperfect certainly. Mismatches happened constantly, but it gave the Army a lingua franca for human potential that it had never had before. And it gave the United States Army something even more valuable when you're trying to fight a global war with a conscript force: a systematic way of identifying the men who could lead others. Because here was the next problem. 8 million soldiers needed officers, a lot of officers. The Army estimated it needed somewhere around 800,000 commissioned officers for the scale of warfare it anticipated. Sandhurst in 1942 was producing British officers at a rate measured in hundreds per year. West Point graduated about 400 officers annually. Neither pipeline alone or combined was going to solve the math. McNair's answer was the Officer Candidate School program. 12 to 13 weeks of training, after which a man received a commission as a second lieutenant, from civilian to commissioned officer in roughly 90 days. To a British officer trained at Sandhurst over the course of 1 to 2 years, this was not merely surprising, it was somewhere between absurd and offensive. They called OCS graduates 90-day wonders. Not affectionately, not at first. The phrase carried a note of professional contempt. The implied question being, what exactly can you learn about leading men in combat in 90 days? What do you know about yourself or your soldiers that the crucible of experience hasn't yet had the chance to reveal? It was a fair question, and the honest answer in the early months was not enough. Some OCS graduates were commissioned and sent to units where they promptly failed to lead effectively. Veterans and NCOs who had been fighting in the Pacific or North Africa regarded some of these fresh-faced lieutenants with barely concealed disbelief. One company commander reviewing a batch of new officers from the Army Specialized Training Program, the college program that fed many OCS candidates, reportedly asked, "What kind of soldiers deal out bridge hands during their 10-minute breaks?" It was a problem the Army knew about, documented, and was actively trying to fix. And that is the detail that no British officer quite expected. That is what sits at the center of the story. The Americans didn't pretend the problems didn't exist. They didn't defend the system when the system failed. They studied the failures the way a factory studies a defective product, forensically, without sentiment, and they changed the process. Remember that instinct because it will show up again in a place that will surprise you. Men like the millions who went through these camps didn't sign up for glory. Many of them didn't want to be there at all. They went because they were told to, because their country needed them, because their brother or their neighbor was going. Every American who completed the training pipeline and deployed overseas, whatever you think of the 90 days that produced them, made a choice to keep going. That deserves to be remembered. Let us be precise about what those British officers saw when they visited American training camps in 1942 and early 1943, because shocked is a word that contains several distinct emotions, and which one you felt depended on when you arrived. In 1942, most of what they felt was skepticism edged with alarm. The scale was staggering, but scale alone does not make an army. What they observed in the early months was a mass of men who looked like soldiers only in the sense that they wore uniforms and were attempting to march in the same direction simultaneously. Fort Benning in Georgia, the Army Infantry School, the largest infantry training facility in the world, was processing tens of thousands of men at a time through a 13-week cycle that the British calculated was roughly equivalent to what a British soldier received in his first few months of basic training, except that after those 13 weeks, the American soldier was typically considered field-ready and could be deployed. British officers visiting American camps in 1942 noted several things that struck them as deeply irregular. The first was the relationship between officers and enlisted men. In the British Army, the social distance between commissioned officers and other ranks was structural and deliberate. Officers came largely from particular social backgrounds. They were addressed differently, housed differently, messed separately. The authority of the officer derived in part from that distance, from the fact that he was visibly, unmistakably, of a different class. An American officer, very often a 90-day wonder who had been a carpenter or a high school football coach 6 months ago, did not always project that same quality. He might eat alongside his men. He might know them by name before they knew his rank. To British eyes, this looked dangerously informal. It looked in certain lights like a failure of leadership structure. The second thing that struck them was what the Americans prioritized. British training in this period placed enormous weight on drill, the formal, precise execution of commands that had governed infantry movements since the Napoleonic era. Drill was not merely ceremonial, it was believed to instill the habit of instant obedience, the automatic response to command that in combat could mean the difference between a unit that functioned and one that didn't. American training used drill, certainly, but it was not the centerpiece. The centerpiece was physical conditioning, weapons familiarization, and a thing the Americans called combined arms training, exercises in which infantry, artillery, and armor worked together on a shared problem. To some British observers, this seemed premature. You were teaching men to coordinate complex multi-arm maneuvers before they could reliably stand at attention. It was, they felt, building the second floor before the first floor was finished. The third observation was the one that produced the most complicated feelings. The Americans seemed in their training to be deliberately trying to teach soldiers to think for themselves. This was not an accident. It was doctrine. General McNair's training philosophy, built into the mobilization training programs that governed every camp, emphasized what the Army called initiative. Officers and NCOs were expected not merely to follow orders, but to understand the intent behind the order well enough to act appropriately when the situation changed and the original order no longer applied. The Army published pamphlets for soldiers explaining not just what to do, but why they were doing it. The 1942 edition of FM 21-100, the field manual every soldier received, contained chapters that explained the geopolitical context of the war, the reasons America had entered it, what was at stake. A British private of the same era was told what to do. An American private was given to a remarkable degree in explanation. There is a man whose story sits at the center of this philosophy in a way that deserves to be told slowly. His name was Audie Murphy. He was born in 1925 in Hunt County, Texas, the son of a sharecropper who eventually abandoned the family. He had almost no formal education. He was 19 years old when he received his first major combat award. By the end of the war, he would become the most decorated American combat soldier in the entire conflict, 33 medals including the Medal of Honor. But in the spring of 1942, Private Audie Murphy was a 112 lb 19-year-old who had tried to join the Marines and been turned away because he was too small and too young. The Army took him. The AGCT took his measure. The training system processed him. What the Army did for men like Murphy, and this is what the British officers couldn't quite categorize, was not manufacture soldiers so much as reveal them. Murphy already had in him whatever it takes to do what he did on January 26, 1945, when he mounted a burning tank destroyer under German machine gun fire and used its gun to hold off 6 German tanks and 250 infantrymen for an hour before finally withdrawing with a wound in his leg. That was not created in 13 weeks of basic training, but it was the training that put him in a position where that quality could express itself, where it could be deployed, where it could matter. A sharecropper's son from Texas, without formal education, who had been born in a different country, in a different class system, would never have been offered that opportunity. The British Army's regimental tradition, for all its genuine strengths, was not built for Audie Murphy. The American machine was. And here is the piece of the puzzle that becomes visible when you understand Murphy's story. What shocked British officers in 1942 wasn't just the speed or the scale of American training. It was what that speed and scale implied about who could be a soldier, who could be an officer. The Americans seemed to be conducting at industrial scale an experiment in the proposition that military capability was not a function of class or background or years of apprenticeship in a particular tradition, that it was something that could be identified, developed, and deployed from almost any human material given the right process. That proposition was dangerous, not because it was wrong, but because if it was right, it meant something uncomfortable about the assumptions the British system had been built on. And then came the moment that changed everything. It didn't happen on a training ground. It happened in a real place with real consequences. In the winter of 1942 and 1943, and it nearly proved the British right, February 19, 1943, Tunisia, North Africa. The United States Army met the German Afrika Korps at a place called Kasserine Pass. You know what happened there if you've read the earlier script in this series. It was a catastrophe. American forces were routed across 30 miles of desert. More than 6,500 men lost. Over 180 tanks destroyed. Hundreds of artillery pieces abandoned to the enemy. The Second Corps essentially ceased to exist as a functioning unit for days. British officers did not gloat. Most of them were too professional for that. But privately, in letters and diaries, some of them wrote versions of what they had been thinking all along, that you could not build a real army in months, that the conveyor belt had produced the appearance of soldiers, not the reality, that all the testing and the training pamphlets and the democratized officer candidate schools had created men who knew the theory of warfare, but had not yet absorbed its truth. Field Marshal Harold Alexander, who commanded British and American forces in Tunisia, sent a blunt assessment to London after Kasserine. He noted that American junior officers and NCOs did not meet the same standard of leadership he expected from British counterparts of equivalent rank. He said in polite but unmistakable terms that American soldiers needed more time. He was right about the problem. He was wrong about the solution, because what he and his British colleagues did not fully account for was the other half of what McNair had built, the part that came after the initial failure, the part that made the system something more than an industrial process for producing uniformed men. Remember what I said earlier about the Americans treating their failures like data? Here it comes. Within days of the Kasserine collapse, American officers were filing after-action reports with a level of institutional honesty that was, by the standards of any army in that war, remarkable. Not reports that distributed blame diplomatically. Reports that said specifically, with examples, what had failed and who had failed it. The communications breakdown, the absence of combined arms coordination, the commander who had built his headquarters 70 miles from the front and communicated in a personal code his own staff couldn't decipher. Every specific failure was documented and analyzed. And then the Army did the hard thing. The thing that is simple to say and almost impossible for any institution to actually do. It changed. Major General Lloyd Fredendall was removed from command on March 6, 1943. His replacement was George Patton. Patton had 17 days to rebuild a shattered corps before the Germans attacked again. The same men, the same equipment, 17 days. March 23, 1943, El Guitar, Tunisia. The 10th Panzer Division, the same formation that had helped destroy American forces 6 weeks earlier, committed 50 of its 57 available tanks in a dawn assault. It expected to find the same Americans it had routed at Kasserine. Instead, it found a kill zone. Patton had placed tank destroyers in concealed positions along the approach routes. Artillery had pre-registered every German line of advance. The Americans fired first, and from positions the Germans never identified. When the engagement ended, the 10th Panzer had lost more than 30 tanks. It was the first time American forces had defeated an experienced German armored formation in open battle. Rommel himself noted in private papers recovered after the war that American commanders had absorbed the lessons of mobile warfare with remarkable speed. 6 weeks. That's how long it took the American system to learn from Kasserine and apply the lesson under fire. But there is something that happened between Kasserine and D-Day that British officers never entirely processed. Something that happened not on a battlefield, but in the cold waters off the Devon coast on the night of April 28, 1944. His name was Harry Houston. He was 21 years old, a private from Pennsylvania, part of the 1st Engineer Special Brigade. He was aboard an LST, a landing ship tank in Lyme Bay, south of England, participating in Exercise Tiger. The exercise was a large-scale rehearsal for the Normandy landings. 749 American soldiers and sailors died that night when German E-boats slipped through the naval cordon and torpedoed 3 LSTs in the dark. 749 men died in a training exercise. The news was suppressed immediately. Any German interrogation of survivors might reveal details of the invasion's scope and direction. So the families were not told. The men disappeared, classified, and the Allied command continued preparing for D-Day with the knowledge of exactly how badly things could go wrong, even before the beaches. Harry Houston was not one of the 749. He survived. He was pulled from the water. He was told to keep quiet about what he'd seen. He kept quiet for decades. He was still alive in the 1980s when the story finally came out. What Exercise Tiger revealed, and what was incorporated immediately into the remaining weeks of Normandy preparation, was a catastrophic breakdown in communications between American and British naval forces during the exercise. The Royal Navy escort had not been properly briefed on the frequencies the Americans were using. Requests for fire support went unanswered because they were broadcast on the wrong channel. Soldiers wore their life preservers incorrectly because no one had adequately drilled them in the procedure. And when the ships were hit, men who tried to use the preservers drowned because the devices flipped them face down in the water rather than face up. Those failures were corrected. In the 6 weeks between Exercise Tiger and D-Day itself, the communications protocols were fixed. The life preserver procedures were drilled until they were automatic. The inter-Allied coordination that had broken down at Kasserine and then again in Lyme Bay in a different way was rebuilt piece by piece from the specific evidence of specific failures. This is when the British officers stopped making their jokes about 90-day wonders, not because the Americans suddenly seemed traditionally trained. They didn't. The informality remained. The class distinctions remained muted. The officers continued to know their men's names, continued to eat alongside them in conditions that would have caused a British mess officer to quietly lose his mind. But something had become undeniable. The American system was, in its own strange way, learning faster than any army the British had observed. Faster, arguably, than the British Army itself. Major General John Frost, the British commander who led the famous assault on the Arnhem Bridge in September 1944, wrote afterward about the American forces he had worked alongside. He was not a man given to easy compliments. He had spent his career in the professional British Army, and he wrote carefully with qualifications, but unmistakably, that American junior officers in the units he had observed showed a capacity for independent decision-making under pressure that he found genuinely impressive. Not because they had been trained to a British standard, but because they had been trained to a different standard, one that prized judgment and initiative in a way the British system did not always produce. By the summer of 1944, after Normandy, after the breakout, after the extraordinary logistics of the Red Ball Express, 6,000 trucks running 24-hour shifts, moving more than 12,000 tons of supplies per day, the British officers who had watched the American training machine with such skepticism in 1942 were being asked a different set of questions. Not, can the Americans make soldiers? They had answered that. The answer was on the beaches of Normandy, in the tank battles of Normandy's hedgerow country, in the ruins of Saint-Lô, in the broken panzer brigades at Mortagne. The answer was in the statistics that the Army's Ballistic Research Laboratory would later compile. American formations in the Normandy campaign achieving a kill ratio approaching 3.6 to 1 against the Panther, the finest German medium tank of the war. Not because the Sherman was a superior machine, but because the men inside it were fighting as part of a system that had been refined through continuous institutional learning from Kasserine to El Guetar to the hedgerows to Aracourt. The question being asked now was harder and more uncomfortable. What exactly had the American training system done that the British system had not? Why had an approach that looked in 1942 like a dangerous shortcut produced by 1944 tactical formations that veteran German commanders described with something approaching respect? General Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored doctrine, the architect of the Blitzkrieg, the man whose panzers had conquered France in 6 weeks, told American interrogators after the war that Patton had conducted a good campaign, and that from the standpoint of a tank specialist, he offered his congratulations. He was complimenting an army that British intelligence in 1943 had labeled amateurs. Guderian's contempt for the British Army's performance in 1940 was well documented. His admiration for what the Americans had become was genuine. The fact that the Americans had arrived at their competence through a process he found philosophically alien, this mass production, testing-based democratic officer factory, did not diminish what the process had produced. What had it produced? Let us be precise about this because the answer is not simply good soldiers. The American training system had produced something the British one, in its depth and tradition, had not fully managed at the scale required for this war. It had produced soldiers who knew why they were fighting. This is not a small thing. The pamphlets that McNair's staff distributed to every American trainee, the lectures on geopolitics and democracy, and the stakes of the conflict, the deliberate effort to treat the American soldier as a thinking participant in the war rather than a uniformed instrument of command. This was policy, not sentiment. It derived from a specific military theory developed in the interwar period that argued a citizen soldier who understood his purpose would outperform a professional soldier who merely followed orders, particularly in the decentralized, fast-moving, combined arms warfare that modern technology was making inevitable. That theory was tested against the reality of the war, and the war returned a verdict. Private First Class Desmond Doss was a Seventh-day Adventist from Lynchburg, Virginia, who refused to carry a weapon on religious grounds. The Army tried to discharge him on 3 separate occasions. He insisted on serving as a medic. On the island of Okinawa in 1945, during the assault on a 400 FT escarpment, the soldiers called the Hacksaw Ridge, Doss remained on the ridge alone under Japanese fire after his unit was forced to withdraw, and over the course of a night and a day, lowered 75 wounded men down the cliff face using a rope and a modified bowline knot. He developed the knot modification himself. He received the Medal of Honor from President Truman in 1945. He was 26 years old. The AGCT had classified Desmond Doss. The training system had processed him. The Army, after its initial resistance, had placed him where he could be most useful. And what he did with that placement was something no test score could have predicted and no tradition could have manufactured. That is the paradox at the heart of the American training system. It was industrial, yes. It was fast, yes. It was disrespectful in some ways of the accumulated wisdom of professional military tradition, and yet it consistently produced, out of the mass of its output, individuals who did extraordinary things, not because of the system exactly, but because the system had been built with enough flexibility to contain them. British officers who came to American training camps in 1942 and wrote in their diaries about the inadequacy of what they saw were not wrong exactly. They were looking at an early and imperfect version of something that hadn't finished becoming itself yet. The America that those British officers toured was an army that had existed for less than a year. It was genuinely rough. The drill was imperfect. The officers were young and uncertain. The institutional muscle memory hadn't formed. What those officers did not account for was what happens to an institution that treats every failure as information. After Kasserine, the after-action reports changed the training curriculum at the replacement training centers within weeks. The failure of Exercise Tiger changed the inter-allied communication protocols before Normandy. The failure of the hedgerow fighting in June 1944 produced within weeks the Rhino device, a welded steel plow that allowed Sherman tanks to cut through the dense bocage rather than climb over it, exposing their belly armor to German anti-tank teams. A sergeant with a welding torch, the system that trusted that sergeant and adopted his solution in 11 days. The British Army was not incapable of this kind of learning. Montgomery's Eighth Army improved dramatically after its early struggles. The British battle school system, introduced in 1941 and 1942, brought live fire and realistic stress into infantry training in ways that genuine veterans recognized as valuable. The British Army that fought at D-Day was not the same army that had been pushed off the continent in 1940. But the British Army had to learn, despite a system that was at its structural core, resistant to the idea that tradition should yield to data. The American Army had built a system that was, at its structural core, designed to make that yield automatic, not comfortable automatic. That difference showed up on the battlefields of Northwest Europe in ways that German officers, British officers, and eventually American officers themselves began to recognize and articulate. There is a final accounting to be done here, because the story of why British officers were shocked has one more chapter. It isn't a battle, it isn't a training exercise, it's a number. By the end of 1945, the United States Army officer candidate schools, the 90-day wonder factories, had commissioned more than 800,000 officers. From 1941 to 1947, the infantry OCS alone ran 448 classes and enrolled over 100,000 candidates. At the program's peak, 12 to 13 weeks of intense evaluation was separating the men who could lead from the men who could fight. And the Army's 2-3 graduation rate meant that the crucible was real. 1 in 3 who entered OCS did not make it through. Of those 800,000 officers, how many were Richard Winters, the Pennsylvania Eagle Scout who entered OCS at Camp Toccoa in Georgia, commissioned into Easy Company of the 506th Parachute Infantry, and led his men from Normandy to Bastogne to the Eagle's Nest. He was 26 years old when the war ended. He had received the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and the Bronze Star. He had jumped into Normandy on D-Day night and been awarded a battlefield commission that was later replaced by his regular commission. He had led the assault on a battery of German 105mm guns at Brecourt Manor on June 6, 1944, an action later taught at West Point as a model of small unit tactics. He was a Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, farm kid who had been processed through the same system that processed 12 million other Americans. The system found him. The system put him where he could matter. That is the verdict. Not that the American system was perfect. It wasn't. Not that it produced consistently better soldiers than the British system. It didn't. The British Army contained men of extraordinary quality, and its professional tradition produced standards that American training could not always match. The verdict is about scale, about the fundamental question that confronted both nations in 1939 and 1941, when the arithmetic of modern war became clear. What do you do when you need not thousands but millions of soldiers? When the old ways of making warriors cannot fill the ranks fast enough? When tradition and apprenticeship and the accumulated authority of regiment and class meet the cold reality of a two-front global war that requires everything you have and then asks for more? The British officers who watched American training in 1942 were shocked because what they saw violated their assumptions about how soldiers were made. They were right to be skeptical. The early product was imperfect. The early system had real problems. They were wrong about what the system was becoming. By 1944, the men who had gone through those 13-week cycles, through those 90-day OCS programs, through that industrial process that had seemed in 1942 like a dangerous shortcut, those men had become something the British military tradition, at its most honest, eventually had to acknowledge. Not manufactured soldiers, revealed ones. The system hadn't built them. The system had found them among the farm kids and factory workers, and insurance clerks and school teachers and sharecroppers' sons, found them at scale, at speed, with a test score and a training pipeline, and an after-action report system that refused to pretend that failure was anything other than information. The British officers who came to American camps in 1942 wrote in their diaries with varying degrees of alarm and contempt. The British officers who fought alongside American units in 1944 and 1945 wrote something different. They wrote carefully with qualifications, with a professional soldier's instinctive reluctance to acknowledge what he had not expected, that the American army had done something he had not entirely believed was possible. It had turned civilians into soldiers in months, and some of those soldiers, under the specific conditions of the specific war that the 20th century had produced, were as good as any soldiers that had ever served under any flag. The 90 days mattered, not because they were enough, but because they were the beginning of something the soldiers themselves completed in the places where training ends and war begins. War is mathematics, but the men who went through those training camps were not numbers. They were farmers and teachers and salesmen and sharecroppers' sons who were asked to become something they had never been in less time than anyone had ever asked it of anyone before. And enough of them did. That is the verdict. That is the thing the British officers eventually, quietly, reluctantly admitted they had not expected to see. If this story changed the way you look at the systems that forge the men who make history, please subscribe and like the channel. We are unearthing the history they tried to bury. Plant the seeds of the future. The next treasure trove will open soon.